Our next speaker is Clyde Magarelli, former Director of War Studies, William Paterson College. He's an author and he's Professor of Sociology at the same institution. Positive Approaches to a Russia-China-India Alliance, the True West Point Intelligence Tradition. Clyde?
Basically, one of the often neglected positions in relationship to economics and wars is how the military feels, particularly the professional soldier, and particularly the heart of the professional soldier in America, which really comes from West Point. It's a tradition that goes back to 1812, and where the moral element is stressed, where weapons change, tactics may change, but the position of war, of moral development, becomes key. That's where it's the will to win, and also the will to win depending upon the righteousness of the effort itself. Now, if those who have been to West Point, and I think I've taken a few up here myself, know that the tradition or the stress for the cadet is a very traditional conception. It's honor, duty, country. From that, they develop the capacity to make the decisions of what is right and wrong, and within the legal framework, they have a duty to disobey illegal wars. Not a right, but a duty to disobey these. We're going to see some dealing with basically three concepts of war in which they look on either as illegal or immoral. They, for the most part, there are three basic concepts of war. The one we now face today is what we call the British concept. It's not a new concept. It dates back to the Athenians, the Spartans, the Athenians, the Carthaginians, the Venetians, into World War I, into World War II. It's a concept that's based upon war is strictly an application of power without any moral aspect to it. And the way that is primarily power is exerted is at the strategic level. We're going to look, if we can meet talk out. The British concept was developed by Mannheim on naval warfare, that world domination can occur by simply dominating the sea. It doesn't really apply the human dimension. The idea is that if I can dominate the sea, I can strangle other nations. I can cut off their food supply and even engage in what we call gunboat diplomacy. Some of the fiction that comes out of World War I and World War II is an application of the failure of that policy. Basically, in World War I, we've had the impression that the naval blockade ultimately defeated the Germans. That's what you see in what we call popular literature. In reality, the naval power had very little to do with deciding the issues of the German defeat, as much as the German adopting, particularly with their navy and what we call the mercurial concepts, the basis of a naval or heavy weapons types of application. So that basically the stress, they moved away from what we call the German policy, which is taught at West Point. That's the human dimension of warfare, the stress on the organization and leadership, into which they applied the concept of strictly heavy weapons, particularly heavy artillery, not by all, but by the leader of the German army, Ludendorff, and he exhausted their soil, and ultimately, it wasn't the front line that broke, but groups associated with the German system in the East, and that's where the collapse ultimately developed. What was learned by West Point, and which was learned by the military, is the failure of the British policy, the failure of naval warfare ultimately to win. We went into World War II. The naval concept was then replaced by the heavy bomber concept. And the heavy bomber concept is that you can win a war strictly by bombing a nation's population. It was called area bombardment. It was basically the idea that you could destroy their industry, you could immobilize their population and their defense, and destroy the will. What came out of that war was a document known as the Strategic Bombing Survey. It was a complete failure. Basically, area bombardment, as far as destroying German industry, reduced it maybe 5 to 10%. At no time during the war did the Germans show a shortage of equipment. They showed a shortage of oil, but that was not from bombardment. It was from the loss of oil to the Russian armies moving in on the oil fields. As far as tying down tying down the Allies or German manpower, it was also often quoted that 2 million Germans were required to fight the bombing raid. In reality, it was only 40,000 military. You did have 2 million that were manning the anti-aircraft systems, but these were civilians. And the worst of all, it was found that the more you bombed, the more the Germans had a will to resist. So again, the conclusion of that theme ultimately was the failure of what we call the British or the material concept. Material meaning pure force without application of science, without application of the human dimension. Now, in the modern times, the so-called Third World War process, that application has been applied to concepts of the nuclear exchange or nuclear weaponry, particularly ballistic missiles. For those who have studied this process, one finds that it became neutralized. That initially the policy that we adopted was a British policy of a first strike. The Russians countered this with a mutual assured destruction because their capacity to retaliate was ensured because their missiles were not in silos or fixed, but were continually mobile. Now, for a while, we were actually toying with the idea of a doomsday scenario. We'll accept mutual assured destruction if enough people, select people, would be saved. And we had a tunnel system, we had cities built within range of Washington to ensure that they would survive. That was ultimately countered with what we call a minimum deterrent concept. Minimum deterrent is that, yes, you may be able to get your elite people in there. And by the way, this was countered by the Chinese. But the day after a nuclear attack, we will send in groups, we'll saturate the areas with high radiation. You'll never come out of that conception. Okay, this is a failure of what we call the thermonuclear system. So what is the German system? The German system we got primarily from France. After the failure of the War of 1812, where we didn't have a regular army. We had destroyed our own regular army. By the way, when we had the American Revolution, we did develop a regular army. And they adopted very traditional concepts. I mean, the element of the human soldier, that means esprit de corps. Esprit de corps is the concept of the unity, the spirit of the unit. That's where you develop the concept that the unit is more important than yourself. And from esprit de corps, you have a capacity to move your troops around, ultimately maneuver. It's a battle of maneuver, and you're led from the front by heroic leadership. That means you don't command from the rear, you show troops what to do. And you have behind it a reserve of conscripts, We had that in the American Revolution. It developed us a while to do it. We got much of it from France, but we developed that conception. What that allows you to do is that even with less troops, you can engage in war of maneuver against systems that have more firepower and ultimately overcome them on a 3-to-1 ratio. Now, just getting back to we said the idea of the British system is to control the main arteries of the maritime system. Now, we're going to go into the second theme. Do we have that here? Oh, right. Here's the schools of war. Basically, you have the British materials based on a financial technical system. In operations, it's unrestricted. It means there's no basis for compassion or the human element. Go after your enemy any way you can, and the easiest way to do that is simply destroy the population. In organizational concepts, it's a managerial system. You lead from the rear, or you use bureaucratic systems or mercenaries. And in ordnance, mass firepower. Heavy weapons, weapons of mass destruction. The German system, as I said, which we have adopted, we had in the American Revolution, was the organizational concept, that the unity of the unit and the heroics of the leadership itself. It follows what we call the rules of war, natural law. The Hague Convention. Why it follows this is an interesting concept, because when I was teaching my own students, I was the head of the War Studies program, we were teaching both Army officers and Marine officers. And one of them had come up to me, and he says, look, the enemy is engaged in torture, horrendous barbarism. Why can't we do that? And I said, look, beyond the fact that it's illegal and it's immoral, what you're going to be feeling if you do that is guilt. And with guilt will come fear. And with fear will come flight. You'll break down in combat. He accepted that. That's what we're looking at, what we call the concept of following the moral principles, and that's what basically is stressed at the point, that the moral concept must be the dominant system that shapes your weaponry systems and your technical systems, or your tactical systems. At the organization, we had talked about that as a regimental system. That means the concept where the unit is held together by a determined esprit de corps and a sense of comradeship on every level. And the ordnance, again, they use advanced ordnance, but it has to be mobile. It has to be relatively small so that it can be used in coordination. Now, there is another system. It's a Nippon, or called the Asian system, which has been used by the Chinese. It's an irregular conception of war. It follows the concept of where the German concept follows the concept of not trying to destroy your enemy, but disorganize them out of superior tactics. The Nippon or the Asian system is you demoralize him by having him confront his own limitations with time, will, and the capacity to take, ultimately, losses. Ultimately, at the end, you give him a concept of magnanimity. Let's stop the conflict. Nothing basically is going to, we will not have even the idea of peace treaty. We'll simply push for peace, where basically with the German system going back, it's a Pax Romana, a just concept. With the British system, Pax Mortuus, the peace of death. Now, the group that has used the Nippon system, China, has lasted the longest. They said they have remained, they're the least aggressive for 5,000 years. Even when conquered, they absorbed themselves on the basis of a superior civilization. We've seen that occur. We have applied that in irregular warfare concepts. It requires higher levels of accepting loss. And one of the key things about them in a battle or military strategy is if your troops cannot accept loss, they will not be able to win. That basically, since the 15th century, every major war has been won by the side that sustains the heavier losses. People have often asked, well, we didn't lose that many in World War II. Yes, we didn't lose that many, but we'll be on the side of the nation that did lose a hell of a lot, and that was the Russians. They contained 83% of the German army. They took 25 to 27 million dead. The war was won on that basis. And the Russians, don't forget, during this period of time, underwent a metamorphosis themselves. By the time of the Battle of Moscow, they were no longer fighting for a dogmatic concept. They were fighting for Mother Russia, and even a spiritual concept. The concept of St. George. They went into the battles on this base. And they were willing to give their lives on that concept. What we're going to be looking at is a third element. Let's get to the effects of not or removing ourselves from what we call the moral element or the German school or the spiritual school. Can we get to the, oh, good, yeah. How do you measure military performance? Well, people say, if you win or not? No. You can be on the side of those who win, and your military performances can be pretty poor. There is 3 methods which is used by the professional at West Point in all military systems, which actually we get along. You know, the professional military gets along very well with other professionals from other nations. Politicians don't get along. But the military, they find themselves with comrades in arms type of thing. But let's examine the crisis of the military as we have in certain areas, naval areas, and in concepts of air bombardment, aerial mass weapons destruction. It has brought, we call, not a military increase in proficiency, but a military decline, a crisis of military proficiency. Now, we put in World War I, and I put the UK and US into a material category, not because they're all that way. It's just that since Theodore Roosevelt took power in around the turn of the century, we moved toward a naval doctrine. In that naval doctrine, we neglected our own army, very severely. We neglected our army, and we put our stress in what we call heavy destructive weapons. The second category is the social, which is the German school, made up of the French, the Russians, and the Germans. And the third, the spiritual school, those who fight for supposedly religious or higher ideals, was the Serbs and the Turks. What we find is because of the overstress on the material, and not the social and not the spiritual, we had to pay a higher cost per kill. Meaning, how much does it cost to kill an opponent's soldier? And we find that basically for the UK it was 80,000, for the US it was 173,000. We see for the social, the French 32,000, the Russians 23, for the Germans 15, and the best categories came with the spiritual. In World War II, same process occurred. We had often neglected the element which is taught at West Point. By the way, West Point has been brought under many attacks since its creation in 1812. The first attack was by Jackson, what was his, right, Andrew Jackson. He wanted it torn down because it was against his policy, it was against his economics. Don't forget, the German school follows the Friedrich List concept, which is right in line with the Schiller Institute, the idea of infrastructural development. That was neglected, and we entered the war with relatively few West Point cadets. And so, in fact, during the war itself, we only 2% of our army were West Point cadets, and that left us with maybe a large army, but nobody else really capable of leading it, so we had to stress what we call the material elements. But again, what we see in World War II, the UK, 401,000, the US, 788,000, the Italy, 246, Russia, 137, Germany, 67, and Japan, 19. Now, in World War III, it should be, I put the wrong thing, it should be World War III, which we're in. We've been on that for, it did not, the Cold War did not end with the collapse of the Berlin Wall. We see in Korea, it cost us 710,000. In Vietnam, it cost us 1,308,000. In Iraq, $18 million a kill, okay? Unprecedented. Actually, that figure has gone up in more recent times to about 24 million. We see basically the NKA, the North Korean, the RV1 much lower, and China much lower. So when you go with the material route without applying, there's nothing wrong with materialism in weapon systems if it's put as an extension of the social and an extension of the material. Ultimately, you pay the cost, and it becomes apparent that the cost per kill gets into the area where it becomes exorbitant. But there's another dimension here, too. I wouldn't say that cost per kill is a critical dimension leading to failure. A second dimension which shows a breakdown in military capacity is the division mobilization per population. Now, a division in an army is a basic unit of about 15,000 troops. 15,000 troops, as I said, is a large number, but you have to calculate how many civilians are required to maintain or support those 15,000 troops. Well, in World War I, we see the same process. To put one UK division in the field required 1,765,000. The US required over 2 million. The Germans were more efficient. Only 276,000, the Russians 570, the French 320. The Turks were the most efficient with 310, and with the Serbs 390. In World War II, we did a little better, primarily because we had started to mobilize. We had started to bring back, not completely, what we call the professional army. And what we saw in the UK, 937, the US, 1,760, the Germans, 243, and you can see basically the Russians. In the Korean War, ultimately, we're looking at 2,300,000. In Vietnam, 4,100,000. In Iraq, 28 million to support one division. Right now, all we have are 9 divisions in the field. In World War II, we had 89 divisions. We can't support them. Why? When you engage in immoral wars, you can't get a population to support you. They will not accept a draft, simple as that. So we have a breakdown. Now we get to the critical level. And that critical level in wars is how much you're willing to pay. Not in money, but in blood. And it's the loss ratio per mobilization. And we saw that basically in World War I, we had just about, we came in late, so just about 1%, the UK 9%. The French, the Germans, the Russians, the Germans, 17%, 12%, 15%. That means how many, the percentage of their army that was lost. By the way, when you go into battle, modern battles, meaning we're talking about, these are what we call the kill ratios. But what is taught at West Point is that when you enter a battle, you should continue to battle to a 20% level. We expect that. That means that with it, if you accept 20%, you can engage in combat that is war of a maneuver. Civilians today can't get close to 10%. That means they have to rely on set-piece battles, heavy artillery, things like that, where it's very inefficient and very destructive. Again, we saw with the question of the Serbs and the Turks taking heavier losses. World War II, only about 2% of our forces actually died. It's interesting about our losses in World War II. There tends to be a tendency that not to admit losses, or particularly among a population that has become very materialized, but to discredit branches of the service that took those losses. And so, yeah, okay, right. And we see that our submarine corps, 22% death rate, were one of the most effective. Again, we look right now in World War III, this concept, Korea 1.2, Vietnam 1.8, and Iraq less than 1%, like 2.1%. Again, this is not appeal to what we call loss. It's appeal that what West Pointers go through, this whole concept is what has happened to the concept of presenting in war the moral dimensions or the social dimensions. And this is where they see the crisis develop. And although we spend close to half the world's population on the world's budget on the military, it doesn't appear to be that effective. And again, the element of that is the absorption into what we call the non-social, the non-moral element, which is the core to the concept of West Point itself. Okay, we'll leave it there. Okay, wait.